In this video, we'll be uncovering the role of African Americans in the founding of the United States. When we think about the founding of the United States, the names that often come to mind are George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin. But what about the contributions of African Americans? Unfortunately, their role in the creation of this country has been overlooked and undervalued for far too long. In this video, we will explore the important contributions of African Americans during the American Revolution, their involvement in the drafting of the Constitution, the influence of African American culture on early American society, and the ongoing struggle for African American rights and representation in America. For far too long, the history of African Americans has been pushed to the margins, considered insignificant in the grander narrative of American history. But the reality is that African Americans have been present in America since the very beginning, and their contributions have been vital to the growth and success of this country. By acknowledging their impact, we can not only honor their legacy, but also begin to build a more inclusive and accurate history of the United States. Through this video, we hope to provide a new perspective on the founding of the United States, one that highlights the contributions of African Americans and their ongoing struggle for equality and representation. It is important to remember that the story of America is not just the story of a few white men, but a story of a diverse group of people who have shaped and molded this nation into what it is today. So let's dive in and explore the important contributions of African Americans in the founding of the United States and gain a deeper understanding of the history of this country that we call home. The contributions of African Americans during the American Revolution. The American Revolution was a pivotal moment in the history of the United States, a time when the colonies sought to break free from the rule of the British Empire and establish a new nation. While the war is often portrayed as a conflict between white colonists and British soldiers, the reality is that African Americans played a significant role in the Revolution as well. Many African Americans saw the American Revolution as an opportunity to fight for their own freedom and the end of slavery. Although the majority of African Americans were still enslaved at the time, some were able to join the fight for independence by serving in the Continental Army or the militias of the individual colonies. One of the most famous African American soldiers in the American Revolution was Crispus Attucks. Attucks is widely regarded as the first casualty of the Revolution, having been killed in the Boston Massacre of 1770. Attucks was a sailor of African and Native American descent who had escaped slavery and was working on the docks in Boston. His death galvanized many in the colonies and helped to fuel the growing resentment against British rule. Another prominent African American soldier in the American Revolution was Peter Salem. Salem was a slave in Massachusetts who fought in the Battle of Bunker Hill, where he is credited with killing British Major John Pitcairn. Salem went on to fight in several other battles and was eventually granted his freedom for his service to the Continental Army. In addition to serving as soldiers, many African Americans played important support roles during the Revolution. They worked as cooks, wagon drivers, and nurses, providing crucial support to the troops. Some even acted as spies, using their knowledge of the local terrain and communities to gather intelligence on the British forces. The contributions of African Americans during the American Revolution were not limited to the battlefield. In fact, many enslaved Africans used the chaos of the war to escape from bondage and seek freedom. Some joined the British forces, who promised freedom to any enslaved person who fought on their side. Others joined the Continental Army or fled to the north, where slavery was either illegal or less prevalent. Despite their significant contributions to the American Revolution, African Americans were not always treated fairly or equally by the colonies they fought to defend. Many were still enslaved, even as they fought for their own freedom and the freedom of others. African American soldiers were often paid less than white soldiers and were not given the same opportunities for promotion and advancement. Despite these challenges, the contributions of African Americans during the American Revolution helped to shape the course of the war and the future of the United States. Without their bravery and sacrifice, it is unlikely that the colonies would have been successful in their fight for independence. Today, we can honor their legacy by recognizing their contributions and continuing to fight for equality and justice for all people. African American involvement in the drafting of the Constitution. The drafting of the United States Constitution is a pivotal moment in American history, marking the creation of a new government that would shape the course of the nation for centuries to come. While the Constitution is often associated with the white founding fathers who wrote it, the reality is that African Americans played an important role in the drafting process as well. One of the most significant ways in which African Americans were involved in the drafting of the Constitution was through their labor. The vast majority of the labor that went into the creation of the Constitution was done by enslaved Africans. James Madison, often considered the father of the Constitution, relied heavily on enslaved labor to complete the document. It is estimated that at least 100 enslaved Africans were involved in the construction of the Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where the Constitution was drafted. In addition to their physical labor, free African Americans also played a role in the drafting of the Constitution. One such individual was Oliver Cromwell, a free black man from Maryland who was hired as a carpenter to help build Independence Hall. Cromwell is believed to have had some influence on the design of the building, and may have had some input on the drafting of the Constitution as well. Another African American who had an impact on the drafting of the Constitution was William Lee. Lee was a free black man who worked as George Washington's personal servant during the Revolutionary War. Lee is believed to have accompanied Washington to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, where he may have had some influence on the drafting of the document. Despite their contributions, African Americans were not allowed to participate directly in the Constitutional Convention. Slaves were not considered citizens and were not permitted to vote or hold public office. Free African Americans, while technically allowed to vote in some states, faced significant barriers to participation, such as property requirements and literacy tests. The Constitution itself also contained several provisions that discriminated against African Americans. The infamous 3/5 Compromise counted enslaved Africans as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation in Congress. The document also allowed for the continuation of the transatlantic slave trade for 20 years and required that escaped slaves be returned to their owners. Despite these challenges, the Constitution was a significant step forward in the development of American democracy, and African Americans played an important role in its creation. By providing the physical labor that built Independence Hall and contributing their knowledge and ideas to the drafting of the Constitution, African Americans helped to shape the document that would serve as the foundation of the United States government. Today, we can honor their legacy by acknowledging their contributions and continuing to fight for equal rights and representation for all people, regardless of race or ethnicity. The Constitution may have been flawed, but it also provided the framework for the ongoing struggle for justice and equality that has defined American history. By recognizing the role of African Americans in the drafting of the Constitution, we can gain a deeper understanding of the complexities of American democracy and the ongoing fight for a more perfect union. The ongoing struggle for African American rights and representation in America. The ongoing struggle for African American rights and representation in America is a complex and multifaceted issue that has been ongoing since the earliest days of the nation's history. While there have been significant gains made in the fight for equality and justice, there is still much work to be done to ensure that African Americans are truly able to enjoy the same rights and opportunities as their white counterparts. One of the key areas in which African Americans have fought for rights and representation is in the realm of politics. Despite the passage of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution in 1870, which granted African American men the right to vote, many states implemented discriminatory voting laws and practices that made it difficult for African Americans to exercise their right to vote. This included poll taxes, literacy tests, and other barriers that were specifically designed to prevent African Americans from participating in the political process. It wasn't until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s that significant progress was made in the fight for voting rights. The passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 helped to dismantle many of the discriminatory practices that had been put in place. And today, African Americans have a much greater level of political representation than they did in the past. However, the struggle for political representation is far from over. While African Americans have made significant gains in terms of representation in Congress and in other elected positions, they still face significant barriers to full participation in the political process. Gerrymandering, voter suppression, and other tactics are still used in many parts of the country to limit the political power of African Americans. Another key area in which African Americans have fought for rights and representation is in the realm of education. For many years, African American children were subjected to inferior schools and educational opportunities, often with inadequate funding and resources. This led to significant disparities in educational outcomes, with African American students lagging far behind their white counterparts in terms of academic achievement. The Civil Rights Movement helped to spur significant progress in the fight for educational equality. The Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954 helped to strike down the legal basis for segregation in schools, and subsequent legislation such as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 helped to provide greater resources and funding to schools serving predominantly African American communities. However, despite these gains, African American students still face significant challenges in the education system. Many schools in predominantly African American neighborhoods are underfunded and lack the resources and support necessary to provide a high-quality education. African American students are also more likely to be disciplined harshly or unfairly, leading to high rates of suspension and expulsion. The ongoing struggle for African American rights and representation also includes issues related to economic inequality. For many years, African Americans were excluded from many areas of the economy and were forced to work in low-paying, menial jobs. Even after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, which prohibited discrimination in employment, African Americans continued to face significant barriers to equal employment opportunities. Today, African Americans continue to face significant economic disparities. They are more likely to be unemployed, to live in poverty, and to lack access to basic resources like affordable housing and health care. African American women face particularly significant challenges, as they are often subjected to both gender and racial discrimination in the workplace. Finally, the ongoing struggle for African American rights and representation also includes issues related to criminal justice. For many years, African Americans have been subjected to discriminatory policing and sentencing practices, leading to disproportionate rates of incarceration and criminalization. This has contributed to a cycle of poverty and marginalization that has made it difficult for many African Americans to fully participate in society. The Black Lives Matter movement has brought these issues to the forefront of public consciousness in recent years and has helped to spur important conversations and policy changes related to criminal justice reform. In conclusion, the ongoing struggle for African American rights and representation in America is a complex and multifaceted issue that has been ongoing for centuries. While there have been significant gains made in the fight for equality and justice, there is still much work to be done to ensure that African Americans are truly able to enjoy the same rights and opportunities as their white counterparts. Throughout American history, African Americans have fought for their rights and representation in many different ways. They have engaged in political activism, educational advocacy, and economic organizing, all in an effort to secure their place in American society. Despite facing significant challenges and obstacles, African Americans have continued to fight for their rights and for justice, both for themselves and for future generations. It is important to recognize the ongoing legacy of African American activism and to continue to support their fight for equality and representation. This means standing up against discrimination and inequality wherever it is found, and supporting policies and programs that promote greater access and opportunity for all people, regardless of race or ethnicity. It also means recognizing the intersectional nature of the struggle for African American rights and representation. The fight for equality and justice is not just about race. It is also about gender, sexuality, economic status, and many other factors that contribute to inequality and marginalization. By recognizing the complexity and intersectionality of the struggle for African American rights and representation, we can better understand the challenges facing this community and work to address them more effectively. Finally, it is important to recognize that the struggle for African American rights and representation is ongoing. While progress has been made, there is still much work to be done to achieve true equality and justice. It is up to all of us to continue to fight for the rights and representation of African Americans, and to work towards a more just and equitable society for all. Before we wrap up, I'd like to ask all of you watching to please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you'll be helping to support our efforts to bring you more content that explores the rich history and cultural contributions of African Americans. Your support is greatly appreciated, and we look forward to bringing you more engaging and informative videos in the future. Thank you for watching.